But there are two important considerations. The first and most important from my viewpoint is that the breach notification rule and the High-Tech Act, which was the kind of progenitor of that rule, focuses very heavily on encryption as a way of protecting digital information. So the feds are moving us all in the direction, if we're going to be communicating using any kind of digital device, if we're going to be storing information, if we're going to be developing records digitally, that we should use encryption. And the way it's kind of legally encouraging us to do that is it says that if I have encrypted data in a way that's approved by the Department of Health and Human Services, and this is their definition, and essentially it's just got to be reasonably strong encryption. The first part is the technical language. The bottom part is my interpretation. Department of Health and Human Services, the feds, want us to scramble the records electronically and use programs that allow us to unscramble them with usually number and letter keys so that other people can't understand them unless they have that key. So are you all familiar with encryption? Everybody familiar with it? Okay. So some people know, some people yes. It's been around for 3,000 or 4,000 years. It was first used by the Babylonians to guard trade secrets. Chinese culture also used encryption. And encryption, very simply put, is creating a code that to you is going to mean nothing, but if you have the key, you will understand it. The most well-known use of encryption, at least militarily, initially was, and the first use of it was Julius Caesar, where what was happening at the time, and there's a reason for my digression here, by the way, but what was happening at the time was that they would have runners to tell the generals what to do, what maneuvers to engage in, what tactics to use. Only they tell the runners, and then the enemy would capture the runners and torture them until they gave up the information. Then they would kill them, and then they would basically be able to undo or to avoid whatever it was at the maneuver that Caesar or others were trying to do. So what Caesar did was he gave these runners a code that the runners didn't understand. Only the generals in the field understood. And so he would say, the geese are going to fly south. And all the enemy could do is torture these poor people, mostly men, and they keep saying, the geese are going to fly south, the geese are going to fly south. They couldn't give them any other information, so that the information was protected. It's a code. So what you're doing is you're scrambling the meaning of all this digital information. And we scramble it now. It's much more simple, and we don't have to worry about being tortured around. Well, maybe we do, but not like that. And for some of us, this is torture. But it's fairly straightforward to use programs that are available inexpensively or even free. There's an online service called truecrypt.org. I encourage you to take a look at the Electronic Frontier Foundation's review of various methods of maintaining privacy, EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation. But one of the things they suggest is TrueCrypt, buyer beware, or in this case, borrower beware, that allows you to scramble, for example, your hard drive on your Dell. You can actually encrypt it, and if you have the key, then you can decrypt it fairly quickly, use the information, and then shut it down, and then it encrypts automatically again. And if I were to try to break in with various software, I need pretty sophisticated software and a fairly powerful set of computers to do what's called a brute force attack, unless I had some clue to what your key was. So the feds are pushing us towards encryption. It's become much more simple, much more straightforward, and easy for us to do. Now, I might as well say it now. Unfortunately, it's become pretty easy for the NSA, and probably for at least some commercial enterprises, to break into encryption. What does this mean for us? Well, we're not required to do better than the Department of Defense or NSA. We're not. It's not realistic. We try to meet the standards in our fields, and right now the feds and DHHS is saying encryption is it. So we try to at least meet that, and there are some things we can do beyond that I'll suggest in a moment. But if we scramble the records, one of the ways they're encouraging us is they're saying, if you've encrypted and somebody steals your computer or hacks into it and is looking at your files, if it's encrypted, they're not going to be able to make any sense of those records. Therefore, it is not a breach if it gets stolen or people get access to the encrypted data. If they, of course, have the key, different story. That's a breach. But if they don't have the key, you don't have to notify people. Okay? So notice what they're doing is, I mean, in some ways it's a carrot and stick approach. Like you get to, mostly the carrot approach, you get to avoid the carrot if you encrypt. And if somebody gets access to your computer or your device. So if you have an iPhone or an iPad, although iPad's a little bit more difficult, at least so far as I can tell. An iPhone, if you have a BlackBerry, enable the encryption, use it, and if your phone gets lost or stolen and you have emails or text messages or phone numbers and information about clients, most of our devices, we could have, like 8, 16, 32 gigs. You can have your whole practice on your phone. Okay? So if you've got that information, the mere loss doesn't mean you have to engage in a notification. If the records are hard copy as opposed to digital in nature, the breach notification rule pushes us towards destroying those hard copies in a way that it can't be reconstructed. So, apropos, if you don't mind my saying so, about when do you destroy records, when you get to the point, maybe 7 years after the service, if it's a straight-ahead therapy or assessment service, that you, if you were to burn them or shred them in such a manner that they really can't be reconstructed, that's considered secure. And if somebody got those big bags full of all your shredded records, you don't have to do a breach notification. Now, there is a minor glitch with that particular method. If you'd like to reuse those records, you can't. Okay? So it only works with ultimately destroying the physical record. But keep that in mind, because otherwise, if there is a breach, we have 60 days, within 60 days of our discovering, or should have discovered, the breach to notify clients. We let them know what happened, what information of theirs was involved, if there's anything they can do to protect themselves, if there's anything we've done to reduce harm to them or to improve our security. We have to have ways to communicate with our clients. And if it involves 500 or more clients, we have to notify the local media. So the reason Stanford notified KTVU was not because they were being nice. It was a federal requirement. Here's what we avoid. There are tiered or stepped up levels of fines if we engage in a breach. So notice essentially what, I'm not going to go through each one, but essentially what the feds are saying is if you go along with this encryption idea, you can avoid having to pay these fines, so long as you act in a way that's consistent with encryption. And these are various levels. I'm not going to get into those specifically. California has not exactly the same kind of rule, but somewhat similar rules, also with various fines and lawsuits. Things are shifting literally underfoot. By next week, well, actually, let me pause on that because I just wanted to mention it briefly. But so if there's any take-home message for you from this, what I'd like you to do is begin to look into encryption on all of your devices for professional purposes. I believe if you're wise, you'll do this for everything you have electronically. It won't necessarily keep you from the clutches of the NSA, but there are, if you do reasonable encryption, you can impede people who might otherwise get access to, for example, your identity or your client's identity, and be able to reduce the likelihood of harm. Nuts and bolts, you download a program. It asks you to go through a series of steps like, do you want to encrypt the whole drive or just a portion of it? And then it asks you what kind of encryption. And, I use the DoD standard, but it sounds great, but high school students hack in every year. And then it says, develop a key. And then you put in a key, which is what you make up. There's debate from what I've read in the literature about the best kind of keys. Some people argue that computers don't do as well with human meaning where we do some randomness in between. So for example, if you used a key, please don't use this key. But you know what the most common key is, right? password, or 1234 or 12345. Those are the most common passwords. You can get into about a third to a half of people's material by entering those terms. Please don't use those. But if you were to use the following key, Mary had a little lamb. It's easy to remember. And then you would insert random characters between the words with maybe a number at the beginning or end. That kind of key gets hard because it's multiple characters. And the nice thing about letters is it could be one of 23 meanings within each rather than one of 9 or 10, right? Because 0 to 9 is 10 characters. Alphabetically, you have 23. So it makes it more complex. And some things that I've read have suggested that computers have a hard time figuring that out when it's based on our meaning, but we throw random things in there, like an exclamation mark, asterisk, whatever it may be. Okay? So you enter that, and then it asks you to put in your key again, and then it encrypts, it scrambles all the data, and it will only unscramble it for you if you enter the key again. So that's how it works. So it's actually become much easier to do with programs. Of course, whatever we can build, we can break. So, people put as much effort, if not more, into breaking code than they do into building code. Or probably about the same. Although you can, for example, say, I want to leave it unencrypted for half an hour or 20 minutes, or but you then would have to go back in and enter your key. Same with your phone, which is one of the things that makes it kind of a pain in the neck. And I have encryption on my BlackBerry. BlackBerries came with resident encryption, so I have encryption on my BlackBerry. I have to do a minimum, I usually have to enter in how many characters before I can do any texting, any access to the content. I am still allowed to answer phone calls or even make them, given how the encryption is built. But you can choose how many tries somebody can have before you securely wipe the whole drive. And be careful with that, because if you don't have a backup, you want to be really careful. Okay? Still, the idea for me to say something like, Mary had a little lamb, is I'm more likely to remember that, and then if I insert characters, it's going to make sense. I will be able to remember it. You want it reasonably long, but if it's random letters and numbers, which I've read other literature that says that you should use those, the problem is that we have a really hard time remembering them. So then what do? We write them down. Or we put them in key vaults, which then, of course, people who are interested in getting all of our information then do brute force attacks for a few months and get all of our keys and then steal all of our information. So I think it makes sense as a compromise to use something that's meaningful for you. Yeah. Once you're in, you're in.
Like using a password.
It's like a password. What's different with just a password versus encryption is a password doesn't scramble the underlying data. Encryption does. Okay? So think of it like passwords, no scrambled eggs. You can still see that there's bullseyes there. And with encryption, it's scrambled. You don't know what is what. Well, with a phone, you're not going to probably use as long an encryption key because it gets to be just unwieldy. But you could do 5 or 6, maybe 7 characters. Interestingly enough, although I'm now believing this not to be true, I read about a month ago that if you do 12 characters or more, it can take, somebody was saying, 15 years to break that code if it's reasonably secure. 12 characters or more. Now that I know that the NSA has broken most of the encryption in the US that most of us use, I'm not so sure that's true. But basically, I've just gotten into the habit that if I want to do texting, if I want to read email that comes in on my phone, anything like that, I have to enter my key. But I make calls without having to enter the key, and I receive calls without having to enter or kind of scramble to make sure I can answer. It allows me just to do one click and I pick it up or whatever. So, you have to kind of decide where the line for protection and then convenience goes. And I err on the side of protection because there's private information on there about clients, even though it's not extensive. And so I want to be sure that if I lose it, or if it gets run over by an airport limo or whatever, that, it's... So that was one step in this attempt to increase security of electronic records. Another step that has almost reached its final point is the final rule for HIPAA, and it includes many, many changes. I'm not going to walk through each one. I'm working my way through them. might be the subject for an exciting 2-hour late night substitution for sleeping pills for you, lecture. But there are going to be a number of changes, such as, in the HIPAA notification standards that we all see, we're now going to need to have in ours information about privacy notification, in our privacy notifications about that we, for example, can only release psychotherapy notes if you get an authorization. We also have to put information in there about the right to be notified of a breach. Okay, so notice that it's paralleling some of the other developments in the law. There's an enhanced requirement for business associate agreements to now meet HIPAA-level security standards. Now that sounds great when you say it, but it's really low-level standards. And what that means is, Pat, if I provide a service online where I can be a data repository for you, and you decide to put your practice online, you would enter into a business agreement or business associate agreement where I would promise you that I would meet at minimum the HIPAA standards. Previously, that wasn't required. Now it's going to be required. So the idea is it elevates the standards for businesses somewhat. They have to do what it is that HIPAA-related or HIPAA-related providers have to do. Does that make sense? Okay. Once a client dies, we have to be in compliance around their records for 50 years. Yeah. That is not the same thing as we have to keep the records for 50 years. Because if our professional organization says 7, right, as we were talking about, or 10, or for Medi-Cal, Medicare, maybe it's 10 or 15, they're talking about compliance. We have to do, once a patient dies, we have to stay in compliance with the standard we used around privacy for 50 years. It's not hard to do. If we get, the thing is that excuse my cynicism a little bit here, but HIPAA standards are so low that that's a no-brainer. They allow us to share so much information with so many different people. It's kind of staggering when you read the law. There's a change, as I mentioned briefly before, a change in a definition of a breach under the notification rule, where it requires that risk assessment. Remember what I was saying, if we shared a case and I gave you information, that's the idea of I would have to do an assessment of the risk of there being harm that would occur due to a breach. So that has been a change as well. Those are just a handful of changes that are going to come down. What I'm imagining is going to happen, to all our delight, is we will get, as we did when HIPAA first went into place in 2003, right? 2002, 2003, we will begin to get updated information from our professional organizations to help us tweak our privacy notifications, bring things into compliance, and to actually do a step-by-step process. But because of what I wanted to cover today, that's not a major focus for this class. I just wanted to give you the heads up. And I think it's the 18th when the final rule goes into place. So it's going to be just next week. So I'm not going to go into other aspects of digital communication because the main theme, although these slides, by all means, if you have questions about them, feel free to ask. But the main themes here are, as I will get to in a moment, the idea of encryption. Okay, let me see if I can get to the final. That we're being pushed to encrypt all data. And I gave detail about various ways to do that, some resources for you in previous slides, but this is the primary thrust. This is the idea underlying the breach notification rule and what we're being asked to do. It's not perfect, but it's probably the best technological solution we're going to have. And I don't know of a good legal solution, because legal solutions are often after the fact, right? So I violate your privacy, you can sue me. The idea is that it will inhibit the ease with which I normally violate your confidentiality, but it's already happened. So we've got to go back and clean it up. So the idea that it's the very technology that poses the risk may in fact be the technology that helps us have an answer. There is quantum encryption coming down the pike. There's also quantum computing that is near a reality in the United States, which means we can have computers that enter our bodies and do all kinds of sophisticated stuff. It's fascinating. It's also really scary. right out of any kind of science fiction horror movie you can imagine. And quantum encryption is essentially the same idea, but at a tiny, tiny level, and apparently it's hard to break, so it's not yet permitted to be used. Neither are quantum computers yet, from what I understand.